Let's talk about Mark Antony and Cleopatra, one of the most famous love stories in ancient history. Or at least, that's how we tend to think of it today. The reality is considerably more complicated than the romanticized version we've inherited through centuries of plays, poems, and Hollywood films. This is a story about power, politics, propaganda, and yes, probably some genuine affection. But mostly it's about two incredibly ambitious people who needed each other to achieve their goals, and whose relationship ultimately contributed to the end of the Roman Republic itself. So let's get into it. First, we need to understand who these people were before they met. Mark Antony, or Marcus Antonius as he would have been known to his contemporaries, was born around 83 BCE into a prominent plebeian family. His grandfather had been a famous orator, though not a particularly successful politician. His father was less distinguished, earning a reputation for incompetence during his military commands. So Antony grew up with a famous name but not necessarily the family fortune or prestige to back it up. This matters because it shaped his entire approach to politics. He needed military glory and political success to restore his family's reputation. Antony was known for living large. Ancient sources describe him as physically imposing, with a thick beard that he cultivated to make himself look like Hercules, from whom he claimed descent. Whether or not anyone actually believed this claim is debatable, but it tells us something about how Antony wanted to be perceived. He was a soldier's soldier, someone who drank with his men, shared their hardships, and led from the front. He was also notorious for his affairs, his spending, and his general lack of what Romans would consider dignified behavior. But soldiers loved him, and in the late Republic, having soldiers who loved you was often more important than having the Senate's approval. Cleopatra's background was entirely different. She was born in 69 BCE as Cleopatra VII Philopator, daughter of Ptolemy XII Auletes. The Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt was Greek, not Egyptian, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals who had carved out Egypt as his personal kingdom after Alexander's death. By Cleopatra's time, the dynasty had been ruling Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, but it was in serious decline. The Ptolemies had a charming habit of murdering each other for the throne, and they'd also developed an equally charming tradition of marrying their siblings to keep power in the family. Cleopatra herself was married to her younger brother Ptolemy XIII when she came to power, though this was purely political and she had no intention of actually sharing power with him. Here's something important that often gets overlooked: Cleopatra was brilliant. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries who bothered to learn Egyptian, the language of the people she ruled. Ancient sources tell us she spoke at least 9 languages fluently. She was educated in mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and rhetoric. She understood economics and trade. She was a skilled diplomat who knew how to read people and situations. The popular image of Cleopatra as simply a seductress who used her beauty to manipulate men is ancient Roman propaganda, and we'll get to why that propaganda existed in a bit. But the historical Cleopatra was far more than that. She was a capable ruler who understood that Egypt's independence depended on carefully managing relationships with Rome, the rising superpower that dominated the Mediterranean world. So how did these two meet? Well, not initially with each other. Cleopatra's first major Roman relationship was with Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Caesar arrived in Egypt pursuing his rival Pompey after the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey was murdered by Ptolemy XIII's advisors, who thought this would please Caesar. It didn't. Caesar was furious that a Roman consul had been murdered by foreigners, even if that consul had been his enemy. This is very Roman. Romans could kill each other, but foreigners killing Romans was unacceptable. Caesar then inserted himself into the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother. Cleopatra famously had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence rolled up in a carpet, or possibly a laundry bag. The sources disagree on the details, but the point is she found a dramatic way to meet with Caesar without her brother's forces stopping her. She was 21 years old. Caesar was 52. She convinced him to support her claim to the throne, and whether this involved seduction or simply brilliant political argument or both, we can't really know. Probably both. The result was that Caesar defeated Ptolemy XIII, installed Cleopatra as sole ruler, and stayed in Egypt for several months. During this time, Cleopatra became pregnant with Caesar's son, Khazarion. This brings us to an important point about ancient politics. Royal marriages and relationships weren't primarily about love or even lust. They were about alliances, legitimacy, and power. Cleopatra needed Roman support to maintain her throne. Caesar needed Egyptian wealth and grain to fund his political ambitions back in Rome. Their relationship served both their interests. That doesn't mean there was no genuine affection, but the political calculation was always primary. After Caesar returned to Rome, Cleopatra eventually followed him there, living in one of his properties across the Tiber. This was scandalous. Romans were deeply suspicious of Eastern monarchs, especially wealthy, powerful ones. The last thing they wanted was a foreign queen influencing Roman politics. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra quickly left Rome and returned to Egypt. She was smart enough to know that without Caesar's protection, she was in serious danger. Now we can finally get to Mark Antony. After Caesar's assassination, the Roman world descended into another round of civil wars. The main players were the assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, and Caesar's supporters, led by Mark Antony and Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian. Antony and Octavian didn't particularly like each other, but they formed an alliance called the Second Triumvirate along with a third partner, Lepidus. This was essentially a three-way dictatorship that divided control of Roman territory among them. After defeating the assassins at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, the triumvirs divided up the Roman world. Octavian got the west, Antony got the east, and Lepidus got Africa. This division would prove fateful. Antony needed to secure the eastern provinces and, most importantly, he needed money. The civil wars had been expensive, and the eastern provinces, particularly Egypt, were wealthy. So in 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. This is where the famous seduction scene comes in, at least according to ancient sources. Cleopatra arrived on a magnificent barge with purple sails and silver oars. She was dressed as Venus, the goddess of love, surrounded by attendants dressed as nymphs and cupids. The whole thing was an elaborate theatrical production designed to impress and overwhelm. And apparently it worked. Antony was smitten, or at least that's how the sources present it. But let's think about what was really happening here. Cleopatra was 30 years old, an experienced ruler who had already navigated one relationship with a powerful Roman. Antony was 42, a battle-hardened general and politician who had seen everything. Neither of them was a naive romantic. What Cleopatra was doing was demonstrating Egypt's wealth and sophistication, reminding Antony that she was a valuable ally who could provide the resources he needed. What Antony was doing was securing that alliance while also enjoying the benefits of a relationship with one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in the world. They spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE together in Alexandria, living lavishly. Ancient sources describe their lifestyle as decadent and excessive. They formed a drinking club called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure. They held elaborate banquets, went on hunting trips, gambled, and generally lived like there were no consequences. During this time, Cleopatra became pregnant with twins. But then Antony had to leave. His wife Fulvia and his brother had started a war against Octavian back in Italy, and Antony needed to deal with the political fallout. He returned to Italy, and after Fulvia conveniently died, he married Octavian's sister Octavia in 40 BCE. This was a political marriage designed to cement the alliance between Antony and Octavian. Octavia was by all accounts a respectable Roman matron, everything that Cleopatra was not in Roman eyes. For the next 3 years, Antony played the part of a proper Roman husband and general, and Cleopatra disappears from the historical record. But in 37 BCE, Antony went east again, and this time he sent for Cleopatra. He acknowledged the twins she had borne him and gave them dynastic names, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and moon. This was significant. Antony was publicly acknowledging his relationship with Cleopatra and their children, something he hadn't done before. From this point on, their fates were intertwined. What were they trying to achieve together? This is where it gets interesting. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his military campaigns, particularly his planned invasion of Parthia, Rome's great eastern rival. Cleopatra needed Roman military support to protect Egypt's independence and expand her territory. But there's evidence they were thinking bigger than that. Antony started giving Cleopatra control over Roman territories in the east. He gave her parts of Syria, Cyprus, Crete, and other regions. He was essentially creating an Eastern empire with Cleopatra as its queen and himself as its military commander. This terrified Rome, or at least it terrified Octavian, who saw a perfect opportunity to destroy his rival. Octavian launched a propaganda campaign portraying Antony as a traitor who had abandoned Roman values for Eastern decadence. He was under the spell of a foreign seductress who wanted to rule Rome from Alexandria. He had gone native, wearing Eastern clothes, participating in Eastern religious ceremonies, and worst of all, treating Cleopatra as his equal rather than as a subject queen. The propaganda was remarkably effective, and it's shaped how we view Antony and Cleopatra ever since. The situation came to a head in 34 BCE with the so-called donations of Alexandria. After a successful campaign, Antony held a triumph in Alexandria rather than Rome. This was shocking. Triumphs were supposed to be held in Rome, celebrating Roman victories for Roman audiences. But Antony held his in a foreign city, with Cleopatra presiding alongside him. Then he made a series of declarations dividing up eastern territories among Cleopatra and their children. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings. Cos Arion was declared King of Kings and legitimate heir of Julius Caesar, which implicitly challenged Octavian's position as Caesar's adopted son and heir. The twins were given vast territories to rule. It was a direct challenge to Roman authority in the East. Octavian used this as ammunition. He declared that Antony had become a foreign agent, that he planned to move the capital of Rome to Alexandria, that he wanted to be worshipped as a god alongside Cleopatra. Whether any of this was true is debatable. Antony probably did envision a Roman Empire with a powerful Eastern component ruled by himself and Cleopatra, but whether he actually wanted to abandon Rome itself is unclear. But it didn't matter what was true. What mattered was what Romans believed, and Octavian was very good at controlling that narrative. In 32 BCE, Antony formally divorced Octavia, which was a massive insult to Octavian. Octavian responded by illegally seizing Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins and reading it to the Senate. The will allegedly stated that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra, which was presented as proof that he had abandoned Rome. The Senate stripped Antony of his powers and declared war, though cleverly they declared war on Cleopatra rather than on Antony directly. This allowed them to frame the conflict as a foreign war rather than another Roman civil war. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. This was a naval battle off the coast of Greece, and it was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra. The details of what exactly happened are murky and contradictory in our sources. Some say Cleopatra fled in the middle of the battle and Antony abandoned his fleet to follow her. Some say they had always planned to break through Octavian's blockade and escape to Egypt. Some say Antony's fleet betrayed him. What we know for certain is that Antony and Cleopatra escaped to Egypt, but most of their fleet and army either surrendered or was destroyed. They spent the winter of 31 to 30 BCE in Alexandria, knowing that Octavian would come for them. Ancient sources describe this period as a mixture of desperate preparation for war and resigned acceptance of their fate. They formed a new drinking club called the Partners in Death. They tried to rally support, but their allies were abandoning them. They tried to negotiate with Octavian, but he was only interested in unconditional surrender. When Octavian's forces finally arrived in Egypt in 30 BCE, the end came quickly. Antony's remaining forces deserted him. He received false news that Cleopatra had killed herself, and in despair, he stabbed himself with his sword. But he didn't die immediately, and he was brought to where Cleopatra had barricaded herself in her tomb. He died in her arms. This much seems to be reliably attested in multiple sources. Cleopatra's death is more controversial. The famous story is that she killed herself with an asp, a poisonous snake, after Octavian refused to let her maintain any independence. But some ancient sources suggest she might have been killed on Octavian's orders, with the snake story being a convenient cover. We'll probably never know for certain. What we do know is that she died, that Cos Arion was executed shortly after, and that Egypt was annexed as a Roman province. The Ptolemaic dynasty was over. So what was this relationship really about? Was it love? Was it political calculation? The answer is probably both, in proportions we can never fully determine. Ancient sources are completely unreliable on this question because they were written by Romans who had a vested interest in portraying Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress and Antony as a fool who betrayed Rome for lust. This narrative served Octavian's purposes perfectly. He couldn't admit that Antony might have had legitimate political goals or that Cleopatra might have been a skilled ruler rather than just a temptress. That would make the civil war look like what it actually was, a power struggle between two Romans over control of the empire. What we can say is that Antony and Cleopatra's relationship was a genuine political partnership. They spent years working together, planning together, and building what they hoped would be a new political order in the Eastern Mediterranean. They had children together and acknowledged those children publicly, which was significant. They celebrated victories together and faced defeat together. Whether they loved each other in the romantic sense is something we simply cannot know. Ancient people didn't write the kind of personal letters and diaries that might tell us about their private feelings. What's interesting is how this story has been remembered and retold over the centuries. Shakespeare's play presents it as a great tragic romance. Hollywood films emphasize the exotic glamour and passionate love. But these interpretations tell us more about what later societies wanted to see in the story than about what actually happened. We want to believe in the power of love to transcend politics and propriety. We want to see Cleopatra as a romantic heroine rather than as a calculating politician. We want to see Antony as a man who sacrificed everything for love rather than as someone who made a series of political miscalculations. The real story is arguably more interesting than the romantic version. These were two of the most powerful and ambitious people in the ancient world who formed an alliance that nearly succeeded in reshaping the Roman Empire. They failed, ultimately, because Octavian was better at propaganda and military logistics, and because the Roman elite could never accept the idea of sharing power with an Eastern monarch. But they came remarkably close to succeeding. The legacy of Antony and Cleopatra extends far beyond their own lives. Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus, used the victory over them to establish the Roman Empire and end the Republic. Egypt's wealth funded his transformation of Rome. The propaganda he created about Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign temptress influenced how Rome and later Western civilization viewed powerful women for centuries. The idea that a woman's political power must be based on sexual manipulation rather than genuine ability is a direct descendant of Augustan propaganda about Cleopatra. In conclusion, the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra is not primarily a love story, though there may well have been genuine affection between them. It's a story about the end of the Roman Republic, about the clash between Roman and Hellenistic political cultures, about the role of propaganda in shaping historical memory, and about two ambitious people who tried to create a new kind of empire and failed. It's a story that reveals the complexity of ancient politics and the danger of accepting ancient sources at face value, especially when those sources were written by the winners. That's the real story of Antony and Cleopatra. Like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.